Okay, this is Aquaculture 3, the third video in the aquaculture series. Um, okay, so we left off with talking about the species, some of the species farmed, and we were talking about green shell mussels, salmon, oysters, and now we'll look at oysters. Three New Zealand species: bluff, rock, and Pacific. But mostly the Pacific oyster is farmed. And this is important for fisheries because the fisheries management of oysters was one of the oysters were actually the first thing that was managed in New Zealand in terms of a fishery, where laws were put into place to restrict the harvesting of oysters. Okay, they are now a little less prolific than they used to be. There used to be dredge oysters over quite big parts of the New Zealand coastline. You used to be able to get things flat oysters like bluff oysters, which are also dredge oysters in Auckland Harbor. Doesn't happen anymore. They've been mostly fished out. But so Pacific oyster is the one that is mostly farmed here in New Zealand now, and it is a invasive species, accidentally introduced to Northland from Australia from the hull of fishing boats that came over. But once it's established here, was initially considered a pest, but then the potential of it for aquaculture was realized, and so now it's well established in Northland, Bay of Plenty in the South Island. And it grows quite quickly, 12 to 18 months. And as we were talking about before, if we can maintain clean water quality, then we could possibly have a huge rock oyster industry. For example, the Tauranga Harbor doesn't have high enough water or clean enough water. Generally, the water quality standards aren't high enough for farming oysters, filter feeders. But there are huge areas that would be appropriate for farming oysters if the water quality was better. Okay, scallops. All right. Three main areas where scallops are harvested in New Zealand and the commercial fishery: Bay of Plenty to the Hauraki Gulf, Golden Bay, Tasman Bay, Nelson, and way up north on Bream Bay to 90 Mile Beach. So north, all the way, not in isolated areas, all the way around the north part of the North Island. Scallop dredges can't operate in Tauranga Harbor, some inner parts of the Hauraki Gulf, and some areas of Whitianga and Great Mercury Island and Firth of Thames. So there are a few areas that are recreational only. They naturally fluctuate because the recruitment is so unstable. So what happens is that the scallops, they'll spawn, and then when they spawn, then the larvae are released and they float around. Some years the conditions are just right for them, and you get huge recruitment into the fishery. Some years, or probably most years, the larval recruitment isn't that high. And so even when they do have a high recruitment, then the natural mortality, 70% or more of the ones that do settle will be predated upon in the first 3 months, or they may settle in areas that are not appropriate and then possibly even starve to death. But if they do settle and survive the first 3 months, they generally have high survivorship from that point, and within 2 to 3 years they'll reach 100 millimeters, which is the legal size for taking. Although in South Island that's 90 millimeters, so you can get a lot. They are prolific enough that they allow them to have to take the scallops at a lower or smaller size. Okay, so with the scallop enhancement, in order to mitigate some of the effects of that variable recruitment and try to even out the fishery and even enhance it, what they do is they collect the spat and grow them on to 20 to 30 millimeters. And Nelson Fishers pay for this project themselves. Okay, this is the scallop enhancement management company, and what they do is the scallop fishers all put in a portion of their returns into this project. Now, it's important to note, and I don't know that we've noted it anywhere else in this class, that the commercial fishing industry is really the only one that's self-funded. The former Ministry of Fisheries has now been incorporated into the Ministry for Primary Industries. But all of the cost for the observer programs and collating that data that comes back from fisheries assessments, stock assessments, and all of the information around or with the management around estimating the maximum sustainable yields and the total allowable commercial catches and recreational catches for the year comes from levies on the fishing industry, the commercial fishing industry. They're not a burden on the taxpayer. Of course, it adds a lot of cost to the fishers themselves. Now, that is probably fair, but if you look at farming and other industries, the government actually puts in a huge amount of research money into farming and technology and other industries, but none into fishing. So, as the fourth largest export earner, commercial fishers do feel a little hard done by in that respect. Probably something worth noting. Okay, so spat are collected on sort of cotton ropes, and with those are what they tend to, when they come out of the larval stage and want to look for a place to sit so that they can start growing up as scallops, then they tend to collect on these the cotton ropes that are hung in the areas around the scallop beds are considered a favorable place for the larvae to settle. So they do settle on those in huge numbers. And then they take them into onshore facilities, grow them to 30 millimeters, so they're less susceptible to predation in the most vulnerable stage. And then they take the 20 to 30 millimeter scallops back out and then dump them onto the scallop beds. And because of this, they get a even recruitment. They always know about how much, what sort of scallops, or what sort of settlement there's been each year. And so you take out that patchy nature of scallop larval success, and so you get a greater number of scallops being seeded back onto the beds than would naturally settle. And so this has gone from this fishery has gone from a state of near collapse to very successful money-making fishery. And because of this, we have obviously we have a 20 scallop limit in the North Island, per person per day. Down in the Golden Bay area, they can take 50 scallops per day, and they can take them at a smaller size. So they've got a much more abundant scallop fishery than we do up here. It's tried on a very small scale in the Coromandel. Hasn't really been tried at a high well, it hasn't really been tried to a large degree in the North Island, but it was less successful. Okay, this is mussel farming. All right, so what happens with mussel farming is they're put the spat are collected, and then they grown to settlement stage, or I mean the spat are collected from the larval settlement stage, and they're put into like essentially a nylon sock, and then hung on lines, and then suspended off of these buoys. You can see the mussel buoys here, and then they grow within that sock until they sort of burst out of it as they grow, and then they're through their byssal threads. They're attached to the ropes that go down. You can see a rope going down right here, and then they're grown for 18 months or so to a marketable size, about 100 millimeters, 100 to 120 or 150 even millimeters, and then brought up and cleaned off of these ropes, and then transported live to the marketplace. And this has become very successful. And in terms of fisheries management, it's been successful for creating a high dollar industry and lots of employment, but also it's brought the price down so far that they aren't worth poaching. So wild populations are under much less pressure. There used to be a lot of poaching of mussels, raffling off in pubs, and people taking a lot more than their limit, and the mussel populations were in pretty bad shape in a lot of places around New Zealand. Now it's so much cheaper to just go to it's very cheap to just go to the store and buy the mussels that you need. You can get them for $2 a kilo, or sometimes even less, sometimes a bit more than it is to go out and collect them yourself. Also, the nice thing about the mussels at the store is they don't have any of the beards, they don't have any of the crusting organisms. You do things like boil mussels with lots of sponge on their shell, and it'll change the taste of the water and a little bit the taste of the mussels. So, in fact, you get a nice clean product when you go to the store that tastes lovely. So people have stopped bothering poaching mussels, and it's been, in a way, the salvation of that of the wild mussel beds. However, it hasn't been a salvation for the commercial fishers. So if you look at the commercial catch, in terms of mussels, some people owned mussel quota, and they were catching a certain number of tons, which has gone down to essentially zero. There's a bit of recreational and a bit of customary catch for mussels these days, but in terms of the commercial catch, those people have seen the bottom drop out of their industry. So their mussel quota has become worthless, essentially. What are the advantages and disadvantages of aquaculture? We've talked a bit about advantages. Here are in terms of fisheries management, here are a couple of other advantages. For the owners, there's exclusive ownership. So in terms of wild fishery, everybody who is a citizen of this country owns all of the kingfish and all of the snapper in the ocean. Now, if you have a quota, then you have a right to access that, but you don't own that stock. However, with aquaculture, you do own the stock that you manage. Potentially, you can have a lot lower costs. You might be able to raise species a lot lower cost than going out and harvesting them from a wild stock. Mussels are a prime example of this. Efficient harvesting process. You can leave the organisms that you're managing, that you're culturing, alive and in great condition until you get your order for exactly what people want, and you harvest exactly that amount, no more, and you fulfill your orders, and so it's a very efficient, non-wasteful way to raise seafood, perhaps. Consistent product and quality. So let's say if you're a restaurant owner, you want to have exactly the same, just so you know what your costs are, you're going to want exactly the same size fish fillet to go out on every plate, and you want people to know exactly what they're going to get. So if you if you have the choice of buying snapper from a farmer who raises them all to exactly a 1.5 kilo fish, which gives you a 0.5 kilo fillet for your plate every time, then you may choose that product over a wild caught fish, which might be anywhere from 5 kilos down to a kilo and a half or a kilo fish. Okay, control over predation. You can limit the access of the predators to your population, to your stock. Genetics. Okay, you can select for the ones that breed and give you the characteristics that you can allow the ones to breed that give you the characteristics that you want. We've been doing that for 10,000 years with cows. And so now we've got cows that can produce 35 to 38 liters of milk per day. And we've got beef cows that produce huge amounts of muscle, way more than any wild cattle would ever produce. So you can choose the same thing. You can choose animals that grow very quickly. So you can get a fish to the market that a wild fish would take maybe 3 years to grow. You could grow one after a few generations that might, by picking the fast breeders or the fast growers to breed, you might get a fish that grows to marketable size in 1.5 years instead of that 3 years. Very large, satisfy the market demand, very large potential markets, as we've talked about with the shortfall, and little or no bycatch. Okay, so if you've got a salmon farm, or if you've got if you're catching something that might be normally caught in a trawler, then of course you're not going to be catching all of the associated fish that also would be caught in that trawler. This is especially big in shrimp farming or prawn farming, where as 500% to 800% of the catch is thrown overboard or non-target bycatch. Okay, and potentially it's sustainable, such as mussels, what you would call a fairly sustainable fishery. All right, the disadvantages. Ethics. Okay, how do you feel? I mean, there's a lot of talk about factory farming of pigs and chickens, but essentially we're doing the same thing with salmon. Is it okay to put thousands of salmon in a pen to swim round and around and around, or should they be able to swim free? Okay, is that unethical to that animal? Privatization of coastline. Okay, there's a lot of talk about foreshore and coastline and who owns it and all, but if you lock up an area put salmon pens in an area or some other mussel lines, okay, that means that people can't fish there necessarily, not commercial fishers. You have essentially stopped the use of that area for any other purpose besides that aquaculture. Now, our coastline is considered to be something that we all own, so if you let somebody own it or use that, then you've impinged on the rights of other people to access it. Aesthetic values, there's lots of questions about whether people want to look out on their $1 million views onto mussel farms, or if they want to look out at a pristine waterway that has nothing in it that they're used to. Disease, bacteria, and parasites, fecal deposits, antibiotics, all consequences of of high density. Algal blooms, if you get a lot of um, nutrients from the poos and wees from these animals going into the water, then these can lead to algal blooms. Some algal blooms can be harmful to human health. Okay, little government support. So if you wanted to start a aquaculture venture, you're not going to be able to get a low interest loan or anything really out of the government besides perhaps a little bit of advice. In fact, it'll be the opposite. You're probably going to have a lot of paperwork and red tape to cut through before you get started. The research and development commitment is enormous. As we've talked about before, we're trying to do in 40 or 50 years with aquaculture what we've been doing for 10,000 years with agriculture and farming animals on terrestrially, cows and sheep and pigs and the like. So there's a lot to learn. Okay, if you have a cow that's wandering around and breathing heavily, then you can call your vet. Doesn't look right. Doesn't look like it's well. You call your vet. The vet will probably have seen whatever those symptoms are before and be able to diagnose with a problem with that cow. If you get a sick fish, first off, it's hard to even notice that you've got a sick fish in your tank. Second of all, there's no vet that you're going to call that's going to come along and say, "Oh, yep, that's red ick disease or something like that." You know, that it's going to be very difficult to necessarily diagnose that fish and know whether that's going to be something that's going to contaminate the rest of your stock. So it can be very expensive and difficult to know exactly how to manage these organisms. And then the bureaucratic and legal problems that we've talked about. Okay. So these fish farms do have impacts on the environment and fisheries that we need to keep in mind before we just jump in that aquaculture as a savior for wild fisheries. So these fish are generally kept in enclosed pens or cages, and they're fed high protein food to encourage rapid growth, usually lots and lots of milled up anchovies and sardines and other byproducts from fisheries. So a lot of that food, though, will possibly be uneaten, and so the waste can sink to the seabed, and then you wind up with lots of nutrients dissolved in the water, lots of bacterial breakdown, and you can have anoxic areas and other eutrophication effects. Okay, so in order to control the disease, as we talked about with high stocking densities, chemicals are added to the water, chlorine, formaldehyde, copper salts, antibiotics, pesticides. Okay, and one example of this is the dichlorvos nuvan, used to kill parasitic salmon louse, but washes out of the cages, killing shellfish, crabs, lobsters, and shrimps. Also blamed for a huge increase of wild salmon having cataracts. And here's what they are combating: these sea lice. Okay, the parasites. Most animals have parasites that are in the wild, but when you get them into high density, parasites are baby-making machines. They absolutely pump out massive amounts of offspring because generally their target species are so widespread that that most of their offspring are going to just never find a host. But once you have them in high density, then you get these, you get like in a salmon farm perhaps, then you wind up with a lot of their offspring finding hosts quite easily. And so here you go, we got a sea lice infection. And one of the interesting polyculture methods that's being tried right now is using wrasses, growing wrasses, and put them into the salmon farms that are cleaner wrasses that will come along and pick these sea lice off and eat them. So that's one way that you might use a biological control to stop putting so much chemical control into your cultured area. Okay, so here's another one: vaccination. You can vaccinate the fish. You pull them out and inject them intensively, or inject them individually, which is an intensive practice and expensive. But this is the type of thing that is needed to raise healthy, valuable fish a lot of the time. And so if you, again, this goes to species selection, where you pick out very hardy fish and try to lower your costs. Okay. Escape threat. Okay, so if you get wild salmon or farmed salmon with different genetic characteristics that you've selected for satisfying the market, and they go into the wild population and interbreed, then the genetic makeup will be possibly diluted of the wild ones, meaning that they're not going to be as well adapted to their habitat, and this could be problematic for that wild population. Okay. New Zealand salmon farming. So we haven't, since we don't farm salmon in the ocean, we farm them in the canals and freshwater, then they tend not to be susceptible to disease. There's freshwater coming through, no salmon upstream, and so they aren't being affected by wild populations' diseases. So no antibiotics or vaccines are added to the water in New Zealand. But the feed is from imported Chilean and Peruvian anchovies and sardines, and the fish meal is actively fish for you. So one of the questions around aquaculture is why not just eat the anchovies and sardines? If you're taking 4 kilos of fish and feeding it to your salmon and producing 1 kilo of fish, is this an efficient use of resources? Okay? Even if you can make more money from the salmon, is this the best way to responsibly use the resources as human beings that we are stewards of? Okay, what animals should you culture? All right. If we're going to look at sustainability, there's a rule of energy transfer, a 10% rule of energy transfer, that is a general ecological rule. So let's say that you are in a desert and you've got some sort of rat that eats cactus, okay? Or if you're going to be in a grassland and you have a deer that eat the grass, okay? Generally, for every 10 tons of animal or vegetable material that the animals can feed on, there's going to be 1 ton of that can support 1 ton of the animals, the grazers, and it continues on through the different levels of the food chain. This isn't hard and fast, but generally you need 10 times the biomass of a trophic level, one below that organism. So if you're talking about a grazer, then you need 10 times the biomass of the grazers in that population in order to sustain that population. Now let's look at this let's look at this with a diagram so it's a little more clear. So let's say you have 1,000 tons of phytoplankton floating around in the ocean, okay, or that you could think of that as grass. Then that will support roughly 10%, so 100 tons of copepods or mussels that graze on that phytoplankton. If it's grass, 1,000 tons of grass will support 100 tons of rabbits. Okay? So if we eat the mussels, if we eat the phytoplankton, then we've been the most efficient in terms of capturing the energy of the sun, and that's been converted into organic material that we can use for nutrient or for as a source of nutrients. Mussels we can use fairly efficiently. We're getting 10% less. But if we start talking about sardines that eat copepods and mussels, or copepods that eat phytoplankton, for every 1,000 tons of phytoplankton, there's only 10 tons of sardines grown, okay, that can be supported. So, and then if we talk about tuna, eating tuna, okay, yes, it's delicious. Yes, it's they're big, fun to catch and all. But for every 1,000 tons of phytoplankton, you can only eat 1 ton of tuna. So which is the most efficient use of the resources of the planet? Should we be harvesting phytoplankton, growing phytoplankton, in order to supply the needs of humans in terms of nutrients? Or should we be farming tuna? Should we be eating mussels and as a choice rather than eating tuna? Okay. And here we go, stated once again. So this is your 10% energy transfer rule from one trophic level to the next. Okay. In early 2000, there was a moratorium on aquaculture in New Zealand, and on more consents being granted. And the reason was because there was willy-nilly development of the industry, but people were starting to complain about their views and whether the places that were getting consent were appropriate. Okay, so now we have these things called aquaculture management areas, and they come out. So the upshot of the consultation process was that aquaculture consents should be given not by the central government, but by local government, by local people. They should decide for themselves where they want aquaculture in their area. And so the council must put aquaculture management areas into their local plans. So local people have the ability to comment on those areas. And then those are the only areas of the ocean where aquaculture can be developed. And no aquaculture can take place anywhere outside of these areas without a change in the district plan. Okay. That is the end of aquaculture.